Welcome to Outrage Science Bites, where we explore the science behind outrage, political polarization, and the ways modern media is fueling division, all in bite-sized episodes. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and in this last episode from our The Role of Media in Social Media Week, we're examining the subject of information literacy. With the rise of misinformation and disinformation, understanding how we process and evaluate information has never been more important. We've got three fantastic experts who will help us understand what's at stake and how we can equip ourselves with the tools to navigate the chaotic landscape of modern media. Let's start with our first expert, Columbia University astronomy professor David Helfand, who will challenge some common assumptions about intelligence and education.
People aren't any dumber than they were 100,000 years ago, I don't think. But there's an issue of education, which, we don't do spectacularly well in this country, at least. And it's not what people often refer to as science literacy. It's really a literacy about scientific modes of thinking, or rational, one might say, modes of thinking. So I don't think it matters one in the slightest that the average citizen knows how a mitochondrion works in a cell, or why Uranus is the distance from the sun and how it takes as long as it takes to go around. Those are all a bunch of science facts they can find if they want them, but they're not very useful. What is useful is having a basic understanding of correlations versus causation, of basic probability to understand the likelihood of something happening rather than just using anecdotal data. The fact that measurements are often uncertain, and that's an inherent part of science or an inherent part of life. And basic quantitative reasoning skills that when you read an article in a paper or hear a politician make a statement that's wrong by a factor of 1,000 or a factor of 1,000,000, you go, that doesn't sound right. Those kinds of skills we're not teaching at all. And those are what are most essential for avoiding the misinformation, disinformation trap.
It's not just about memorizing facts. Science literacy is really about understanding how to think. Whether it's discerning correlation from causation or understanding probabilities, these are the kinds of skills that allow us to see through the fog of misinformation and make better informed decisions. This is particularly relevant in an era where misinformation isn't just about lack of facts, but about deliberately misleading narratives that thrive on people's inability to critically assess information. That's where education becomes so important. Our next expert, Mark Lenker, a librarian focused on information literacy, expands on this. He explores how the definition of information literacy is changing and how important it is for consumers to understand not just how to find information, but how to influence the media and political landscape.
So, as a librarian, the subject matter that I concentrate on most in terms of my teaching is information literacy. And the classic version of that is helping people to learn to find, evaluate, and use information. But as we become more awake to the challenges of our information ecosystem, especially as it relates to politics, the definition is kind of expanding to include concerns like polarization, how our kind of a more and more common feature of our information landscape is information that seeks to make you angry, especially in the political realm. It's kind of an interesting question. Where should this fit in the college curriculum or in the curriculum in high school? Maybe it would fit in high school civics, but at the university level, if you don't take any political science classes, it's an interesting question of where it fits, where you learn about these things. As a librarian, we kind of have to know some things about how information works on the publication end, but also on the consumption end. And as consumers, we occupy a really powerful spot in the information ecosystem. If we make it known that our preferences have changed, the media, the political campaigns will have to adapt to adopt a new strategy that'll work better. So yeah, I think a turning point is coming up. On the other hand, boy, those ads, just negative. Everything from the other person's incompetent to the other person's the incarnation of evil. It's pretty rough right now. So I think we need to keep at it and let students especially know that there are other possibilities. It doesn't have to be this way.
Political polarization and media manipulation shape our information environment. Librarians and educators have a growing responsibility not to teach just how to find information, but how to evaluate it, particularly in the face of misleading and anger-inducing media content. While it feels like we're bombarded with negative political ads and sensational headlines, we do have some agency in this. The choices we make about what we consume and how we respond can send a message to those producing the content. Educating ourselves and the next generation about these choices is key to improving our media ecosystem. Now let's dive deeper into the psychological side of information literacy. Our final expert, Melanie Tresick-King, brings a wealth of insight on fostering critical thinking through science literacy and debunking pseudoscience. She explains how our emotions and motivations can cloud our judgment and make it hard to evaluate claims objectively.
We want to be open to any claim, but we don't want to accept a claim without sufficient evidence. But evaluating that evidence is critical thinking. That is the core of what we're doing with critical thinking. And I think a lot of people, what they do is they have a belief in mind that they either want or don't want to accept. And they use what they think is critical thinking to support that. Whereas real critical thinking understands our underlying motivations for why we might want or not want to believe something, and to be honest with ourselves. That's the hardest part. So critical thinking is evaluating claims to come to the best possible conclusion. But to do that, we have to be honest with ourselves. And I would hold that's the hardest part of critical thinking. So as a science educator, there are a lot of important science issues for which there are major denial movements, and there are pseudoscience movements as well. And a lot of science educators, then, what we do is we go in and we try and address that form of misinformation. But what I've learned about critical thinking is that it's not enough to know how. You have to want to do it. And that requires us to back up and be honest with ourselves. But I've also learned that in that process, our emotions get in the way. Our emotions are why we believe what we believe often, right? We hear it from people we trust, we experience something. And so once we attach to it, especially if our identity is attached to it, we run with it. I start with training wheels on, and I teach students how to evaluate these claims, how to think about thinking, how to think about where their beliefs come from and the evidence for their beliefs and confidence for their beliefs and proportioning it. The point is evidence, right? Evidence matters.
Critical thinking isn't just about knowing what's true or false. It's about evaluating evidence while keeping our emotions in check. Often our beliefs are shaped by our own personal experiences and emotional ties, which makes it difficult to change our minds even when presented with new evidence. That's why training in critical thinking is so crucial. It's not just an academic skill, it's a life skill. It helps us step back, evaluate the evidence in front of us, and be honest with ourselves about why we believe what we do. So what can we take away from this episode? First, as David Helfand told us, education, specifically science and information literacy, needs to focus on teaching how to think, not just what to think. Mark Lenker reminded us that we have the power to shape the media and political landscape through the choices we make in consuming and responding to information. And finally, Melanie Tresick-King underscored the importance of evidence, especially in managing the emotional biases that can cloud our judgment. By understanding these principles, we can arm ourselves against disinformation and improve our media consumption, making us more informed and engaged citizens. Thank you for listening to Outrage Science Bites. If you enjoyed this episode, you may want to check out the long-form Outrage Overload podcast. Visit outrageoverload.net for past episodes, links, and contact information. Be sure to tune in tomorrow as we begin the next series for Week 2, The Psychology of Polarization, the science behind our toxic political environment.